Hi, good evening, everybody. It's great to be here tonight. I'm Janice Kaminer-Resnick, and on behalf of Jews United for Democracy and Justice and Community Advocates, Inc., I warmly welcome you to tonight's America at a Crossroads virtual town hall program. We are very grateful to Ambassador Dennis Ross, a person of unparalleled experience with the Middle East, to give us his thoughts about the current events in Afghanistan. Full unedited recordings of all of our programs can be found on our YouTube channel and on our website. We always provide an easy link in all of our emails, so you can always find them. And if you have any trouble, just send me an email. Our judge leadership team includes former Congressman Mel Levine, David Lehrer, former LA County Supervisor, Zev Yaroslavsky, Caroline Kelly, and Rabbi Ken Chazen. You saw our list of co-sponsors on the screen a moment ago, and we are all grateful to our co-sponsors. Many of us have just celebrated Rosh Hashanah, the Jewish New Year, and we are now in the very important 10 days of repentance, the days between Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, when we are supposed to be reflecting on our past missteps and thinking of ways to be better people in the coming year. I think that's very important. But I have an overriding thought about all of the Jewish holidays, of which there are many. My thought is how the holidays are a means of marking time. The holidays and the rituals that accompany them create beginnings and ends. The Jewish holiday calendar counts days, weeks, months, and years. The message to me is clear. It's about the preciousness of time, that we should be mindful to ensure that we use the gift of whatever time is allotted to us to use it constructively and carefully, as it is our most precious, non-renewable resource. We are living in complex and challenging times. Some might even say we are living in times that are a bit dark. But like Ralph Waldo Emerson wrote, this time, like all times, is a very good one if we but know what to do with it. We wish all of those who celebrate a good and thoughtful fast and a good year, a year which recognizes the sanctity of time. Now, my colleague David Lehrer will give you some information about our upcoming programs. David?
Thank you, Janice, for those very thoughtful words. I couldn't agree more. It's a pleasure to welcome everyone to another in our America at Crossroads virtual town halls. Tonight, we'll learn a lot about foreign policy and what the momentous events in the Near East of the last month actually mean. We'll be hearing from a career diplomat who has led high-stakes negotiations on behalf of the United States with friends and foes alike. Although we will not have a program next week due to the Yom Kippur holiday, we will resume our usual Wednesday evening programs in 2 weeks on Wednesday, September 22nd. Our guest will be the Atlantic's highly regarded columnist pundit, David Frum, and he'll be interviewed by KCRW's Madeline Brand. The following week, September 29th, you'll not want to miss the prolific Washington Post op-ed columnist Jennifer Rubin. She'll be discussing her new book, which is coming out next week, Resistance: How Women Saved Democracy from Donald Trump. Jennifer will be interviewed by tonight's host, Patt Morrison. Then on October 6th, we'll have one of the most prominent members of the United States Senate joining us, the man who literally holds the balance of power in the U.S. Congress, Senator Joe Manchin. He'll be interviewed by KCRW's Warren Olney. And now to introduce this evening's guest and moderate tonight's discussion, a winner of 2 Pulitzers, 6 Emmys, and a dozen Golden Mike Awards, the incomparable Patt Morrison. Pat?
Thank you, David, and thank you, Janice, and thank you to the organization and its sponsors for tonight's program and all of the programs you see here. Well, his resume is enough for 10 people, and it's all packed into one formidable brain. Ambassador Dennis Ross, now at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. But before that, he was a special advisor, I think they call it Middle East quarterback, for President Obama. He was special advisor to Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, spent more than a dozen years shaping the U.S. role in the Middle East peace process. He was the point man for this process under Presidents George H.W. Bush and Bill Clinton, worked at the National Security Council and the Pentagon during the Reagan administration. I think you'll agree that is formidable. And equally formidable, he's a UCLA graduate. Ambassador, thank you for being here.
My pleasure. Good to be with you.
You want to make your Bruins pitch first? We'll get that out of the way.
Yes, they're surprisingly good in football. This could be a very promising year, and I think even basketball may be even more promising.
All right, you can take it to the bank. Thank you, Ambassador. The topic tonight is chiefly Afghanistan, but it's a topic whose roots go back a long way with the United States, and of course now most vividly with the 9/11 20th anniversary upon us. the US then was the superpower and the wrong party in the eyes of the West. You saw headlines in like the one in the French newspaper, "Today we are all Americans." So if you want to talk about that 20 years and how it's changed our international position before we get into the specifics of the end of the Afghanistan engagement.
You know, if you go back to 2001, in many ways, the US was the uber power. We had a unipolar world. We didn't have a multipolar world. We didn't have a bipolar world. The Cold War had ended. The Soviet Union had collapsed. Russia, throughout the 1990s, was in a state of economic disarray. It was coping with what was almost a complete loss of order within the country, not to mention what they called the near abroad. So the US was really the dominant power on the world stage. And interestingly enough, when George W. Bush became president, his campaign had focused on Iraq, at least in foreign policy, on Iraq and ballistic missile defense. It was not, and the whole notion was we're going to compete with other powers as they begin to emerge. There was it's fair to say there was a kind of an American hubris that whatever we chose to do, we could do internationally. And so then 9/11 happens, the war on terror is declared. The only time that Article 5 of NATO has ever been invoked by all of our allies was when we were attacked on 9/11. There was a sense, as you correctly said, that the French were saying we're all Americans now. There was a great ability to identify with us. You know, one of the elements of soft power that is often underplayed, but shouldn't be underestimated, is when you have a great deal of soft power, others simply accept your objectives. They look at you. It's not just that you're a magnet for what's right. It's that you are seen as basically having adopted the positions that others should share. Now that gives you tremendous leverage internationally. Now, when we pursued a war in Afghanistan starting 6 weeks after 9/11, there was almost universal acceptance of our position. And the truth is, I think that was pretty much the case until Iraq. Iraq is really a dividing point. You know, we see the French being very much against us. We have one clear supporter with Tony Blair in Britain, and he feels the need to emphasize the Israeli-Palestinian issue because in Europe that's seen as more pressing somehow than going to war in Iraq. So we go from a position of having kind of universal acceptance to pursuing a war in which there is a great deal of controversy and a great deal of questioning about us. The prosecution of that war also, over time, it drags on, and that even raises more questions about us. The use of, I would say, some of the decisions that were made about how we were going to justify rendition, how we were going to rationalize the use of excessive force, or we won't call it, quote, torture, but how we would interrogate those as part of the war on terror. Much of what we did contributed to a kind of loss at that time of American soft power, some of which, to be fair, was restored during President Obama's time, at least at the beginning of the Obama administration. So there's the soft power dimension where I think our great weight and our attractiveness was diminished. Then there's the hard power that as we became consumed in Iraq, but we never left Afghanistan, we became involved in wars that were very expensive, but very hard to demonstrate success. And that obviously made it more difficult for us to act in certain ways. Ultimately, as we began to look for ways to withdraw, that created vacuums, and others began to fill those vacuums. And now what we see is a world where we're not the only strong power internationally. We're challenged in more places than we've been. It doesn't change the reality that the US still ultimately has more power than anybody else, but the key for us is to be able to use that power wisely.
So then, to the events of the last few weeks, the consensus, there's always a split between politics and policy when it comes to reaction to these events, but some of the expert consensus is split. Robin Wright in the New Yorker called it America's greatest retreat, at least as humiliating as the Soviet withdrawal in 1989, perhaps a bookend for the era of US global power. The editor of the Sunday Telegraph in London called it a botched exit that's merely the latest sign that the American era is ending. But the National Review agreed with your assessment that we should stop the doomsaying, that US credibility will weather Afghanistan. Why do you believe that, given what seems to be beyond the political reaction, the policy reaction, and then the international repercussions?
I believe it basically for a couple of reasons. One is I've seen this movie before. I've seen the hand wringing that says, oh, that's the end of American credibility. I saw it after Vietnam. You know, I saw it during the Reagan administration after the pullout from Beirut. By the way, something that Osama bin Laden cited in 2000.
After the Khobar Towers bombing that killed hundreds of Marines, right?
The Khobar Towers was during Clinton. This is a Marine barracks bombing in Beirut.
I beg your pardon.
But very much the same point. Black Hawk Down during the Clinton administration, Khobar Towers during the Clinton administration. President Obama's Red Line. There are no shortage of examples where America seems to be found wanting, and others react to say, well, that's the end of American credibility. Think back to Vietnam, the debacle at the end. That was, again, a point where, well, who is going to trust us now? Even on Afghanistan, we spend a couple $2 trillion, we spend 20 years there. That's not a sign of commitment. I mean, I think we all have to take a step back. And instead of drawing these conclusions about that's the end of the story, first you have to be reminded that history tells us that there have been many such stories, and yet we were able to recoup, number one. Number two, we do have more power militarily and economically than anybody else. And we have allies and friends who don't see an alternative to us. You know, it doesn't mean that they automatically feel the same level of trust in our reliability, but they still feel the need for us. So when I say, let's maintain our perspective, by the way, I'm not saying that we didn't pay a price. We have paid a price. And it is up to us to recoup, but we have the ability to recoup if we have the will to recoup.
So Afghanistan, our presence there, the Taliban takeover especially, it doesn't happen in isolation. So can you reset the pieces on the chessboard of extremism and terrorism, given this?
You know, I think the answer is it does become more difficult because I do find it hard to believe that Afghanistan with the Taliban won't be more of a haven, even if the Taliban isn't exactly a replica of what they were before. And I have to say that while their approach to public relations is different, the fact that they're appointing mostly everybody from the past should give us some pause. I think ideologically, they are in tune with other radical Islamists. Will they really act against them? Maybe. But even if they do, one of the problems is going to be their ability to govern, like most other Islamists. Almost every place where we see radical Islamists in power, whether Sunni or Shia, they can't govern. The track record here is very clear. They can't govern. The Taliban won't govern effectively either. Now, the fact that they won't govern effectively also means there will be spaces within this state where, whether they want it or not, like the Islamic State, ISIS, which is actually a competitor of theirs, they will find ways of insinuating themselves in spaces where the Taliban doesn't find it so easy to control. So there will be others acting there. The more they can plan operations, the more they will. The fact that we won't be on the ground will make it more difficult. It doesn't mean we lose all capabilities, but it will make it more difficult. So you have A, greater difficulty from a practical standpoint. B, you will have a surge psychologically of all sorts of Islamists being emboldened, saying, you see, with enough patience, God shows his favor on us, or her favor on us, although they wouldn't say her, they would simply say his. So for the Islamists, there'll be a sense that Now's the moment for us to do station identification again. Let's stage more events to show we're here. There will be an effort, I think, to try to become more active. Now, that also creates the ability for us to be cooperating with others who will also have a need to respond to these threats. Again, we have the means. Terrorism, much like climate change, much like pandemics, terrorism is not something you effectively can deal with only on your own. You need partners. It doesn't respect borders. Others are affected by it. You add to your own capabilities, not just militarily, but intelligence. All these capabilities need to be pooled. You need to develop a stronger division of labor. That can be done, especially if others are feeling that they're more likely to be subjected to threats as well right now. So yes, the ground is going to be different. It's going to create new challenges. Some will be more difficult for us, but also we will find that we have others who are looking for ways to make themselves more secure. They will be looking to us. We can also be looking to them. Again, it's not hopeless. And those who want to wring their hands and say, look at where we are now, they ignore fundamentals in some ways haven't changed. The Islamists are who they are, and they will continue to threaten everybody else.
What are the ripple effects in the Mideast about this, especially among, well, all the stateless terrorists who now say, hey, we've got a state, even if it's not one that's ideologically necessarily to their liking?
Look, the main ripple effect, I think, will be a surge in some recruitment, for sure, because there'll be more of a sense that their narrative is being validated. I mean, here is the Taliban, they persevered, and look who they overcame. They will sell this again as their mystical power, and that will certainly add to their ability to recruit. And as I said, the more they recruit, that also threatens states in the region as well. Look, for a country like Iran and the Revolutionary Guard and the Quds Force, who actually want to use the same kind of instruments to spread themselves throughout the region, they also face a challenge. In 1998, Iran almost went to war with the Taliban. The Taliban killed 9 Iranian diplomats, and they had acted in a way where they were affecting the water flow actually into Iran. So they almost went to war. Iran mobilized 200,000 forces on the border with the Taliban. Now, both right now are trying to say they're going to work together. But already the Quds Force came out and has been critical of what the Taliban has done, even at this point. So ideologically, they are competitors from the Taliban standpoint, and the radical Sunni Islamists look at the Shia as being heretical. So the idea that they will find it easy to work together doesn't mean it's impossible, but the fundamentals in their case are fundamentally competitive. And Iran, I think, will probably be quite nervous about what's going to happen there. They'll want to manage what's happening on their border. You think about the following. Iran has a terrible drug addiction problem. In some ways, it's a manifestation of public alienation from the regime, but they have a terrible drug addiction problem. Where do you think most of the drugs come from? Afghanistan. Where has the Taliban, where has it made most of its money?
Drugs.
The drug trade. So the idea that they will find it so easy to work together, not so clear. And even though you asked about the Middle East, I just want to say, China and Russia kept their embassies open. But if you think they're each really comfortable with the Taliban, the Chinese, obviously with the Uyghurs, have tried to suppress what is Muslim identity. The Russians have found they face great terror coming out of Central Asia. So each of them have their own reasons to be nervous. The less stable Afghanistan becomes, the more it affects those countries that border it. Well, Iran borders it, China borders it, and Russia borders it.
We don't, I gather, and probably won't have a diplomatic presence anymore in Afghanistan, where there is some economic leverage, and the Taliban are concerned about that, given what you described, the deplorable economic conditions. So what kind of influence does the U.S. wield, should the U.S. wield?
A lot depends upon how practical the Taliban becomes in terms of recognizing if they can't deliver something in terms of governance, that they're going to face an ongoing war within Afghanistan. As I said, I look at some of the current appointments so far of the caretaker government, and it doesn't exactly give me much confidence that there's been much change. To the extent to which they realize they have to deliver something, the leverage we have, not only in terms of the assets that we have frozen, but it's also, we affect the World Bank, we affect the IMF, we affect what the Europeans are prepared to do as well, or certainly we have influence on that. So we've frozen $10 billion in assets, but the assets that we might be able to influence are dramatically higher than that. So that gives us some leverage, I think, first in terms of helping to ensure an evacuation of those we want to get out continues. It gives us some leverage, I think, to try to affect the way the Taliban will govern and will treat women. I have to say I don't have a lot of confidence here, but it gives us some leverage. To the extent to which the Taliban doesn't want to be totally isolated, here again, from a political standpoint, we can mobilize the rest of the world to isolate them. So it's not just economic leverage, it's also political leverage, which keeps them isolated and which tells them it'll be hard for them to recoup any of these assets. At a minimum, we should be doing this to see if we can influence them. There's leverage is both positive and negative. Sometimes you use leverage to punish, sometimes you use leverage to create incentives. And we have some potential here. I don't want to oversell it, but we have some potential here. A lot depends upon, does the Taliban approach governance from a more practical standpoint this time or not? And that we're just going to have to see.
The meta question that's been bumping around for weeks now is whether or not the withdrawal was bungled. And I kind of think of it in terms of the old metaphor of Schrodinger's cat, the cat in the box with the poison, and the cat is dead in the box, even though it's not actually dead. The cat will be dead when you open the box. It was never going to be easy. It was never going to be neat, but was it bungled?
I'm glad you asked me that question because I draw a distinction between two decisions. The decision to withdraw is one you can debate. It is certainly, in my mind, a defensible one. I can also make the case on the other side. Those who argue that we could have easily sustained the status quo either are failing to understand reality or not presenting an honest position. And I say that because when I hear people say, President Biden was prepared to reverse other Trump decisions, it's as if all these decisions are equal. Well, they're not. In one case, there was an agreement that if we walked away from the agreement, the Taliban, which had refrained from attacking us, which was the only thing they lived up to in the withdrawal agreement. This wasn't the only part of the withdrawal agreement, but it was the only thing they lived up to. The minute we walked away from the withdrawal agreement, they would have then started attacking us to impose a price on us to force us back to withdrawal. So there would have been a price. When you talk about the decision, you have to talk about the price that would have been imposed on American forces. We would have lost people for sure. That is clearly something that weighed very heavily with President Biden. But it should weigh heavily with anybody who makes these decisions. Now, there were countervailing costs as well, and we've been talking about that. We can't have as good an ability to deal with the potential for terror within Afghanistan. We won't. And it's again, that's just a fact. But when you make decisions, you weigh the relative costs. This was one where you make a decision that is the least bad decision. And the idea that you'd be able to get out of Afghanistan if you stayed now is also an illusion. If we couldn't get out after 20 years, there's no reason to believe we could have gotten out in another 20 years. So that decision, I said, that's debatable. I'm afraid the other decision in terms of implementation is not so debatable. I'm afraid here it was bungled. And I say it was bungled because there's a dynamic that was followed here. There were two things that were going on. One was there was a groupthink that was established pretty quickly that this was actually going to work out okay. And I can tell you from a lot of experience in foreign policy making good things never happen when there's groupthink. You need to be challenging some of the assumptions, and that didn't happen this time. The second element was when the president made the decision to override the military's advice on staying. The Secretary Austin and General Milley wanted us to maintain a presence of about 3,500 forces in Afghanistan. When the president made the decision to override that, when the military came in with their plan focused on only one objective. That objective was to get our forces out safely. Now, that was a completely fair objective, but it wasn't all of the objectives. We had a moral obligation to all those who had worked with us. And those numbered, obviously, not just in the tens of thousands, but more than 100 to 200,000. That meant we required a presence throughout the country so we could get those who were outside of Kabul to Kabul. That meant we had to maintain a presence that was larger. It meant the approach should have been to challenge the military and say, look, this is very important to get our forces out safely. But that's not the only objective. Because it was treated as the only objective, it was done stealthily, it was done more rapidly. We got out of Bagram Air Force Base, we didn't coordinate it all. And we were in a situation where we withdrew the military before we withdrew the civilians. And we should have basically said, look, that runs a high risk of not working. Yeah, nothing is ever going to be simple and without some disjuncture, some mess. But what we need to do is basically say we're going to need longer to withdraw. You tell the Taliban we're getting out. You tell them if you hit us at all, we'll hit you very hard. You begin the process of evacuating from outside of Kabul sooner. Again, you stretch out more time so you don't have to do what Ghani asked the president not to do, is don't pull a lot of people out quickly because it'll create this kind of psychological collapse. So with more time, with the right kind of planning, with presence throughout the region, you could have made this work more effectively, and you certainly could have met our moral obligation of getting all the people out who really entrusted their future to us and to whom we had a moral obligation.
So over this 20 years, it's like it was the equivalent as if we were fighting World War II while trying to bring the Marshall Plan into effect, this nation building at the same time we were fighting to push back the forces that were against nation building. So just let me list some of the numbers. So $8 trillion when you include the costs of veterans care, almost 2,500 American service members killed, 3,800 US contractors, 66,000 Afghan national military and police, more than 47,000 Afghan civilians, 1,100 NATO ally forces, 72 journalists. What did we get for all of this?
I think the answer is, unfortunately, regrettably, not a lot. I mean, the one thing that was being produced, we did create education in Afghanistan that had been lacking. We created a set of women's rights that had never existed in Afghanistan. We created a future for many people, which is now at risk. So, look, Afghanistan isn't called the graveyard of empires for nothing. And our big mistake was transforming the mission from a counterterror mission into a nation building mission. Afghanistan has resisted occupiers from the outside forever and always successfully. Afghanistan was not unified. We were trying to unify it. We launched a policy, and by inertia, we maintained basically the same approach over time. One of the lessons to be learned again is constantly ask yourself hard questions about what you're doing. I teach, and one of the things I tell my students, don't fall in love with your own assumptions. You constantly have to question those assumptions. Otherwise, you fall into a trap. And we did. We fell into a trap in Afghanistan. And it was hard to break it. Anyone who was going to make the decision to reverse this was going to pay a price. To his credit, President Biden said, look, I'm not going to stay there forever. And you're asking me to make a decision to stay there forever. And I don't have confidence that they're going to become self-sustainable. If we can't leave now, then when can we ever leave? and how ultimately will that help them become more sustainable? So the theory was, I remember when President Obama came in, and I remember vividly because Richard Holbrooke and I had offices next to each other for the first 6 months before I went to the White House. We had offices next to each other in the State Department because we were, of everybody there, we were the two guys who'd had a lot of experience doing negotiations and diplomacy. So we would sit and talk, and he said to me, look, if I can't succeed in breaking the endemic corruption, we can never succeed. This was 2009. We never succeeded in changing that. And part of it was we were trying to impose from the outside something that, in effect, you could not impose from the outside. So there are lessons to be learned here. And one of the lessons is you look at the numbers you recited, and there's very little one can say that in the end justifies that. Do we, those who say, but look at the price we're going to face in terms of dealing with terror. Yeah, as I said, the risk goes up somewhat, but you have to weigh that against what the cost has been over time, and the fact that that cost, even if it was going to be lower, it was going to continue.
An expensive lesson, and I'm wondering about how long it'll last, because people still have within some memory the nice, quick little war. I'm using those terms sarcastically. The first Gulf War, where you get in, you win it, and you get out. Is America still in love with that idea, or is the fact that this is a 20-year war, that a quarter of America's population has been born and lived exclusively within the time frame of this war, has that cured us?
I think when you say it, it's a reminder. We ended up having different generations fight this war, which is another way to think about how long it went on. I think that the challenge for us continues to be, what is the role of force in terms of backing diplomacy? But that's the point. Force is never an end in itself. Force is one of the tools of statecraft. You have all sorts of tools of statecraft. When I hear people say, well, diplomacy is our first tool, yeah, but diplomacy involves itself lots of different tools. It involves the use of economy. It involves the use of public, how you frame issues. It involves how you work with others. It involves intelligence. It involves covert actions. What is required is the effective use of all of the tools that we have, including coercion, including the use of force in certain circumstances. But the key of good statecraft is, how do you marry objectives and means? And if you establish objectives that you will never have the means to achieve, what that should tell you is, you know what? Those are probably not the right objectives. Maybe we shouldn't be pursuing that policy. We will face threats, and you have to make a judgment, what's the best way to deal with those threats? I would hate to see us react to this by withdrawing so much that, in a sense, we don't deal with threats that will build up over time. The hesitancy to do anything will probably contribute to those circumstances where we face much bigger threats, where when we have to react, the price is much higher and the options are much worse. So what you're hearing from me is a plea for us to think about how we integrate all the tools at our disposal, which also means where we lack the means ourselves, we figure out who else has the means and who can join with us, and how we become persuasive, both positively and negatively, to get them to play those roles.
One of the many differences between Vietnam and Afghanistan is that people were sick of the Vietnam War. They were sick of what they saw every night on television, whereas with Afghanistan, they'd almost forgotten about it, because in 2020, someone calculated that the three networks covered maybe 5 minutes of all of their news, all of that year, about Afghanistan. And that was only because of the Trump announcement of the Doha agreement with the Taliban. Do you think that vacuum of information, that lack of it, contributed to some of the reaction that we've been seeing about the withdrawal and the nature of it?
I do. I mean, look, Vietnam was so different. You had the draft, you had, demonstrations in the street, you had a war that was broadcast on TV every night, and just the cost was so profound, and it tore this society apart. Afghanistan is based on a volunteer army. Afghanistan was distant, and the costs, at least in the last couple of years for us, was low. But as President Biden said, the cost for the military families was not so low. And one thing I just want to mention, I know what weighed very heavily on President Biden was, even if the costs were low, he was quite sensitive to it. For him, he didn't define this as being low because when we suffered fatalities, he felt them very personally. You know, people don't know because obviously he's from Delaware, and Dover, Delaware is where our fallen heroes come back in caskets. He would go there much more often than people know. And I will tell you, I had a personal experience, not with him, but during the Obama administration, the vice chair of the Joint Chiefs of Staff asked me and a few others to go with him to Dover to meet the families of those who were receiving their fallen heroes and speak to them. And I can tell you, having gone there, trying to comfort a 19-year-old woman who has just lost her husband and has two little kids is something that I will never forget. Now, I'm not saying that should be the only factor that influences whether we make decisions to use force. Because as I said, if that's the only factor, there will be times when you won't use it when you need to. But it has to be a factor for those who make these kinds of decisions. You should never be thinking about using force in a kind of abstract way, because there are real people who pay the price. And that was a key factor, I think, for President Biden, and it's one that I can relate to.
Before we go to our audience questions, and there are many good questions to put to you, Mr. Ambassador, yours is a diplomatic career, diplomatic pursuit, but you're always mindful of politics. And it occurs to me that if Republicans take the House in 2022, we're going to see endless hearings about what happened in Afghanistan, just as we saw Benghazi hearings, but the multiplier will be much bigger.
Look, we live in a polarized reality right now. It would be great if of the traditional adage that politics stopped at the water's edge was actually true. It hasn't been true for a long time. If you want to have a productive foreign policy, it's good to learn the lessons from the past. But if the aim is to use that as a bludgeon, it'll be designed to actually preempt having an effective foreign policy, not to conduct one.
Greg had a question that many people have been asking, which is, what will our adversaries like China and Russia, with vested interests in undermining a US-based world order, see as their opportunity and their advantage in Afghanistan? And I suppose the same question can be asked on the second tier about Pakistan, which had a fraught relationship with the Taliban already over these years. So where does this reset for China and Russia, and then as consequence to our relationship with Pakistan?
I mentioned earlier that Russia and China will look at Afghanistan with some unease. On the one hand, we've already seen it. They will publicly play up how unreliable the United States is. The Russians will contrast it with, look at how we stood by Assad. And China will basically say, look, you can't count on the US. But it doesn't mean that they're going to be so comfortable about what goes on with the Taliban in Afghanistan. They'll be trying to see what they can sort out. They'll be uneasy about the reality. The Russians have already built up a presence militarily, anticipating that they need to hedge bets. So on the one hand, there's the reality that they'll try to gain advantage out of it in a political sense. On the other, there's the practical reality that they're probably uneasy about it. The truth is, we can do a lot to recoup if we make it clear, first of all, as the president was doing, he said Russia and China were happy to see us tied down in Afghanistan. Now, the implication is when we're not tied down in Afghanistan, we're able to compete more effectively with them. Well, that means we better compete more effectively with them. By the way, this is not the time to be pulling out of the Middle East. This is not the time to add to the sense of what is the American position. One of the things I wrote in this recent article was we should be going to the Europeans, we should be going to our friends in the Middle East as well, and saying to them, look, here is what our stakes in the Middle East are. This is what we are prepared to do to fulfill those states. Here are the kind of things we need from you for us to be able to act in a way that works for our mutual interest. Now, part of that is designed to reassure them. Part of it is designed just to explain what we're about. I can tell you, I was just, the end of July, I was in the Middle East. And one of the, we were getting out of Afghanistan, but obviously the imagery of how we got out hadn't yet taken place. But I was getting a lot of questions in the area about what was the administration's approach to the region. What I was hearing was, we see responses to individual challenges, but we don't know how this is knit together. This is a very important time for the administration to be explaining that privately and publicly. And that's another way to begin to position yourself to compete with the Russians and the Chinese as they try to present a kind of different story.
Elliot in Ann Arbor wants to know whether you think that George W. Bush is shifting the battle to Iraq is one reason, maybe a key cause for the Taliban not being defeated completely and thus able to regroup easily and take over Afghanistan again.
It was in my mind, it was a fundamental mistake. We should have completed the counter-terror mission. The defeat of the Taliban, first of all, the defeat of the Taliban in the end, if you think back, it was not that different from the collapse of the Afghan government. We clearly scored a number of victories, and then suddenly they just collapsed. But that collapse meant that a lot of the Taliban just sort of melted back into their local areas. And they never really went away, and they bided their time. And because we shifted our attention away, that meant at the time we shifted forces away, intelligence assets away, everything became focused on Iraq. If we were really going to be serious about pursuing the counter-terror mission, and this was after all the war on terror, then we should have stayed in Afghanistan, not shifted to Iraq the way we did. Now, can I guarantee everything would have been fine? No, because as I said, no one can guarantee that. But if the focus had been on the counter-terror mission, we would have spent much less. We would have been focused on a mission that was more achievable, and the cost would have been more sustainable. We would have lost far fewer people, and you would have seen far fewer Afghans killed as well.
Ambassador, you spoke of the military's input about when it came to the question of withdrawing from Afghanistan and how we're going to be blind on the ground there as a consequence for intelligence from leaving there. But Phil wants to know, how serious were the shortcomings of the intelligence agencies in Afghanistan, presumably in the lead up to the withdrawal?
Well, I think, as I said, there was groupthink. I think it's pretty fair to say that there was a failure of intelligence someplace. I mean, look, we, at least in the military, we trained every one of those units. We should have had a pretty good, this is not, by the way, it's not just, it's, when I say intelligence, it's intelligence writ large, a lot, and you disaggregate it. There was intelligence as it related to the security forces. I can tell you back in 2009, 2010, when I was in the Obama administration, there was a sense that we could put the Afghan military in a pretty sustainable position, but that the police forces were in a terrible state then. And we know near the end, they were still in a terrible state. We also know there was a lot of corruption. We know there were a lot of ghost soldiers, meaning monies went to fund units that went into the pockets of those, but not the soldiers. Soldiers frequently weren't being paid. We were in a position to know a lot, number one, as it related to what was the status of some of these units. Number two, the Taliban was basically cutting deals throughout the country over the last several months. This involved thousands of people. We were in a position to know that. There was a lot that we should have known. I guess the way I would describe it, Pat, is that this was a case of strategic surprise. In every case of strategic surprise, you always had all the information you needed. The problem wasn't the information, the problem was how you interpreted the information. You create a set of assumptions in strategic surprises, and you interpret information through that prism of assumptions. You know, you go back to Pearl Harbor, we knew everything we needed to know. The Israelis before the 73 war knew everything they needed to know. They even had Nasser's son-in-law feeding them intelligence. But there was assumption that, well, the Arabs knew they couldn't win, so they wouldn't fight. You know, every time you have strategic surprise, and even I would say, I left out 9/11. 9/11, obviously, we needed everything we needed to know, but there were a set of assumptions, the dots weren't connected. The same this time. Everything was there that we should have been able to know, or and should have had access to. Somehow, the assumptions that guided us basically ruled out interpreting a lot of what was coming in the way it probably should have been interpreted.
In the spring of 1975, when the U.S. withdrew from Vietnam, there were startling scenes of sailors pushing helicopters off aircraft carriers to keep them out of the hands of the North Vietnamese. And this time around, there was concern about what was left behind for the Taliban. I did read that there were some equipment that was disabled, that the Taliban showed up and was rejoicing over all of the loot that they had gotten, only to find that it had been sabotaged, fatally sabotaged. But Linda says, why, if we knew so far in advance that we were leaving, did we leave so much behind? And Linda's in Carmel. Thank you, Linda.
So here again, it really relates to the previous question. We were leaving it behind for the Afghan military. The theory was, okay, we have trained this military, we have trained them on our weapons, we can't pull all the weapons out because then we're going to leave them bereft. So much of what we left was for the Afghan military. The problem was the Afghan military simply collapsed. So had the assumption been that the Afghan military is going to collapse, then we would have pulled out much more of the equipment. But the idea was we were leaving this for them so they would be able to sustain themselves.
And the question repeats itself, and some people use the phrase ragtag army. Why is it that the United States, that this Allen, our best military, couldn't defeat a ragtag army of recruits, as being the Taliban, not nearly as well equipped or trained? Or why was it that the training that we offered over decades didn't stick with the Afghan forces who were there and whom we expected to take over, as we expected the South Vietnamese to take over?
Part of it, again, is soldiers will fight for a cause, and they'll fight for those who they think are committed to that cause. But if the leaders are basically corrupt, if the leaders are stealing the money that's supposed to go to pay them, we have Afghan soldiers that would go for months not getting paid. Money was going there, but it wasn't going to them. We have Afghan soldiers who didn't get any logistic support. They would run out of ammunition. Why? I mean, so it's not that the training was necessarily at fault, but the whole logistics system. Part of the problem was when contractors left, they weren't in a position to continue to be able to perform.
Were they the quartermasters then, the contractors?
They were in many cases, yes, not entirely, but to keep the helicopters and the planes running. There clearly wasn't enough done to put Afghans in a position where they could do this on their own without us. But again, I would say the major part of the collapse was that you basically had soldiers who just basically said, I'm not going to fight for these guys. Who are the same thing? We saw the same thing happen in Mosul. At the time, when the Iraqi military at that time had 30,000 forces in Mosul, and ISIS at that time was said to have around 3,000. And the 30,000 just disappeared. Again, that was the time you had a very sectarian leadership. Maliki was the prime minister. He put in charge of the military all of his cronies, Shia cronies. They didn't care one whit for the soldiers. Same thing, they didn't get paid. Oftentimes didn't get ammunition. So if soldiers are not going to fight if in the end they think they're not fighting for a cause or for a leadership that believes in that cause. And I think we saw a lot of that in Afghanistan, just as we saw it at a certain point in Mosul. The irony today in Iraq is that with a much smaller American presence, there probably is a more significant, sustainable Iraqi military because they have become more convinced of what is a threat to them. But it's complicated because you have all the Shia militias, and many in the military see that as a threat to them. So in these areas that are characterized by sectarian conflict, tribal identity, much of what will be sustainable depends upon the leadership and who are in the front lines, who has to do the fighting.
We did have a couple of questions about whether you ever were in a position or even did counsel a president to get out, pull the plug.
On Afghanistan?
Yes.
I was really not. I left the Obama administration at the end of 2011. So, and I wasn't in the original. There was a debate in 2009 about whether or not we should have a surge. Then Vice President Biden argued fervently against it on the grounds that we couldn't remake Afghanistan, and the surge was based on that kind of a premise. The president went along with the advice to do a surge, but he then said, after 1 year, we will then start drawing down. And his rationale was, after 1 year, if those who say this is going to work, they should have proof of it. And if it has worked, fine, they won't need us the same way. And if it hasn't worked, this isn't going to be the case. So I was on the periphery of that debate, really removed from it. I was aware of it. So I can't really say I played a role in it. My own attitude at the time was very much we should be pursuing a counter-terror objective, not a counter-terror mission, not a counterinsurgency mission.
Maybe it's the last question before we allow you to wrap up. A lot of viewers would like you to drill down a little more into the U.S. relationship with Pakistan. Osama bin Laden, of course, was found and killed in Pakistan. That border has been notoriously fluid, and as a consequence, our relationship with Pakistan has been a very nuanced and delicate one over the years. So where do matters stand now? How about Pakistan's own relationship with Afghanistan under the Taliban? It must have something to fear, and would it turn to us in that case?
It's a really interesting question because there's no doubt that Pakistan played a double game. Its intelligence services supported the Taliban because they saw it as anti-Indian. The Indians established a presence in Afghanistan, and so much of what guides Pakistan is what they do against India. So that was one strand of the policy. On the other hand, Pakistan has had to deal with terrible terror from the Pakistani Taliban, and so they played a double game, but they got burned by the double game. It's already signs that there's tension now on the border with the Taliban. So they have, on the one hand, they have leverage on them. On the other hand, they're also the victims of it. They have been terrible. They've suffered terribly from terror attacks, and Pakistan is a state where there is a very strong constituency of radical Islamists. The victory of the Taliban is like fuel for them. So it puts even more pressure on the Pakistani government. They have to figure out how do they manage that. If they concede too much to it, they themselves won't survive because it'll simply feed the appetite to do more. So I do think Pakistan is caught in a trap in some ways of its own making. And now it has to figure out what to do about it. We can't be indifferent to it. This is a country that has probably close to 200 nuclear weapons. We used to talk about not having the worst weapons in the worst hands. Well, we have a huge stake ultimately in the stability of Pakistan. And figuring out how to manage that is a huge challenge. I watched different administrations try to do that. I didn't see any that succeeded at it. The question is now, with the Taliban back in control, does it create a different set of interests or incentives for the Pakistani government? My guess is yes, but I think it's also going to be constrained by how they deal with their own constituency of radical Islamists. And they have they've tried what I would call both a carrot and a stick approach. Too often at times, I think they've used the carrot, which hasn't been very effective. The stick comes at a high cost. So it'll be interesting to see. My guess is they will find some need. They will see some value in a relationship with us. We will have to decide, what it is that we're prepared to do based on what we see them doing. And unfortunately, the track record with them, as I said, isn't a great one in terms of them playing double games.
I've been asked to slip in this last question because there's so many of it. So before you can wrap up, maybe you can give us a short version of this about, if all the corruption was so well known as it was going on, why did the U.S. just cut off funds? I'm sure it's a nuanced answer, but if there's a quick nuanced answer.
Well, look, the short answer is from time to time, we did withhold funds. There was a time when basically Karzai's brother, we targeted Karzai's brother. I mean, there were things we did where we tried to affect it, but it was so deeply ingrained, and you were trying to figure out, how on the one hand, do we stay involved in a way that gives us some chance for success, and yet at the same time, if we put too much pressure on them on corruption, does the whole system just collapse? And how do we pick up the pieces? We were constantly caught in the horns of a dilemma, but that dilemma was based on, in a sense, again, the wrong objective. So long as the objective was basically, we're trying to build a new Afghanistan, we couldn't succeed. The smarter approach would have been, okay, we're going to cut back, but we're going to focus exclusively on counterterror, much smaller involvement. We can help you where you need it. We're going to focus on what is the key threat to us. Had we done that, we wouldn't have, in a sense, been, I think, as frustrated, not only with our overall approach, but also with what were fits and starts when it came to trying to counteract their corruption. We would make these efforts, then we would back off. We would make them again, we would back off. And over time, for the most part, we gave up.
Ambassador, can you give people maybe a 1-minute précis on what to look for, and what are the red flags? What are the mountaintops that people should be looking for as the next year and two unroll in Afghanistan?
Look, I think in Afghanistan, the key thing to be watching is, do we see some sign of real practicality on the part of the Taliban? Do they decide that, in fact, they have to govern and they're really not an ideological movement? If they're an ideological movement, nothing will change. If they realize they have an ideology, but they have to govern, then we'll see greater practicality. And that'll give us some leverage to affect their behavior. That'll give us some leverage to make it less likely. First, they may be more stable as a result. And if they're more stable, they may have a greater stake, and we may be, with others, able to help ensure it doesn't become a platform for terror. So that I think is the most important thing to be watching for in terms of Afghanistan. I'll just flag one thing for the future. We're going to face a big challenge from Iran right now, not only on the nuclear question, but what they're doing in the region. Because partly, I think they feel with a government that is much more ideological extreme than its predecessor, not in the sense of it's night and day in terms of their commitment to the Islamic Republic, but in the sense that they believe in confrontation with the outside world because they think it justifies stricter internal controls. Zarif and Rouhani felt it was better for the long-term well-being of the Islamic Republic not to be in confrontation. Well, now you have the principalists, all of those controlling every institution share that view. And I think it means they're more likely to test us. It's going to be very important for us to demonstrate to them that it's costly for them to go down that road.
Well, Dennis Ross, Ambassador and UCLA Bruin, thank you so much. A very valuable hour of insights, and it's much appreciated. Thank you again.
My pleasure. Glad to do it.
And a reminder to all of you, a week from Wednesday, David Frum will be here. David Frum from The Atlantic, talking about the lasting impact of Donald Trump on the world and on politics. He'll be interviewed by Madeline Brand of KCRW. Thank you all for joining us. Thanks to the sponsors, the members, and everyone who joined us tonight. I hope we'll see you back here in a couple of weeks.